There is always an undercurrent of urgency when law enforcement confronts armed criminals. Get down, get down, get down! The commands carry the weight of imminent danger. This was an extremely perilous crew. They moved with the precision of a well-rehearsed and carefully planned operation. Heavily armed and prepared for battle, they posed a constant threat. It was only a matter of time before someone got hurt. They were truly terrible human beings. The mission is clear. Remove these threats from the streets as swiftly as possible. Here it comes, it is on. Adrenaline-fueled manhunts, tactical takedowns, and intense games of cat and mouse unfold across America as elite teams of FBI agents dedicate themselves to hunting down the most wanted criminals. Every single day, they place their own lives on the line to safeguard yours. This is law enforcement at its most extreme. This is FBI takedowns. All had been quiet on what seemed like a beautiful day in the Boston area, when a routine armored car pickup transformed into something far more sinister. Put your hands up, get down, hands up, hands, don't be a cowboy. The first robber's responsibility was to gain control of the courier. The second robber would disarm the courier. The third robber's task was to disarm the driver. They were heavily armed. They were prepared to engage in battle if necessary. In any armored car robbery, it is understood that the employees of the armored car company are themselves armed. The individuals who carried out these robberies knew their trade and knew it well. This crew operated with speed. They aimed to strike swiftly, complete the robbery, and vanish. Shocking as it may be, the robbery in Lynn, Massachusetts represented just one incident in a troubling wave of similar crimes sweeping the Boston area at that time. Armored cars were being targeted at a startling rate, 3 times higher than in most other states. 2 suspects had been waiting in the Bank of Boston lobby. An armored car was hijacked as it pulled into position. This presented an extremely dangerous problem, one that the Boston FBI field office addressed by forming a specialized bank robbery task force. Whenever a bank robbery or armored car robbery occurred within their area of responsibility, they would receive a phone call. The vehicle had handicap plates. There is always an urgency when dealing with armed criminals because no one can predict when things might spiral out of control and innocent people could be harmed or killed. On the day a substantial sum was taken from the armored car in Lynn, the task force descended upon the scene with urgency. They were wearing masks. I couldn't see who they were. The assault vehicle was a minivan. They had darkened the windows so that no one could see inside. They had stripped out the seats to create space for the assault crew. Full Halloween masks completely obscured their identities. These were professionals. They confirmed this fact across town a few hours later when the getaway car was discovered. The interior had been completely burned out. That would eliminate any potential evidence such as fingerprints, DNA, hair, or other materials that forensic examiners might uncover. These individuals struck with lightning speed before vanishing without a trace. We had handicap plates. We had masks. It had to be the same group. All signs pointed directly to one notorious Boston neighborhood. It was well known among law enforcement that when a robbery was sophisticated and well planned, or when it involved an armored car, the perpetrators were very likely from Charlestown. Most of Charlestown is a typical blue-collar suburb, yet a small group has earned the area its reputation. Historically, there have been many bank robbers originating from Charlestown. Investigators would begin their search there to identify those responsible. As a young new agent, I was told that the reason Charlestown had such a significant presence of bank and armored car robbers was because the old Boston State Prison had once been located in Charlestown, and many families had moved into the area to visit the inmates. Once those inmates were released from jail, they chose to establish roots and remain. Charlestown possesses a rich history as a very close-knit, almost tribal neighborhood. It was a very Irish enclave. It was one of the most focused places in the country. Spanning only 1 mile square, people lived there for generations and rarely left. Several families passed down the trade of bank robbery, armored car robbery, and petty thievery from one generation to the next. Becoming a skilled bank robber was akin to a rite of passage for that small element within Charlestown. For better or worse, Charlestown residents fiercely protected their neighborhood's criminal industry. Hey guys, can I speak to you for a minute? It was pretty well known as a town with a code of silence, where very few people would provide information about those robbers, whether out of admiration or fear. You guys know anything about some robberies in the area? Sometimes they would simply walk away. Sometimes they would not answer the question, or they would make it clear they had no interest in cooperating. Individuals from Charlestown would not rat, would not snitch. That made the investigation extremely difficult because nobody wanted to testify. Code of silence, man. Come on, get out of here, cop. The code of silence became something heard on the streets, uttered in a mocking tone, meaning, screw you, don't bug me. Agents canvassing the area for information about the robbery in Lynn made little progress. Later, another armored car heist occurred, its resemblance to the one in Lynn unmistakable, though this one appeared more polished. Typically, the best parking spots are handicap spots, so they would park there because the armored car would park near the front door, as the guards and couriers wanted to minimize the time spent between the business and the truck. They were well rehearsed and well planned. They cased their targets, conducted surveillance, used stolen cars and often a switch car. They wore masks and gloves, leaving no evidence behind. They would always try to have a second set of athletic gear to strip off after the robbery, altering their appearance. The brazen criminals even had a backup plan in case the flames failed to destroy everything. They would attempt to salt the evidence. For example, they had obtained hair from the floor of a barber shop and spread it inside the getaway vehicles to contaminate any potential evidence. They had committed enough robberies to become highly proficient. It was not the amateur mistakes where one might call another by name. Even so, agents believed they had identified the ringleader of the operation. Cormac Riley was a professional bank robber and armored car robber. There was information indicating that Cormac Riley was active at the time, making it likely he was involved in that robbery. It was assumed he was involved in subsequent robberies as well. Cormac would be meticulous in scoping out his locations. His reason for such caution stemmed from a previous 6-year prison sentence following a bank robbery conviction. It was a place he vowed never to return to. During that period, many bank robberies were committed by individuals using presidential masks. Cormac often spoke about how this was the reason the movie Point Break had been made, claiming he was the first to use such masks in that way. If Riley was their man, the FBI needed to bring him in soon. If he remained free, there was real danger that someone might get killed. Cormac Riley was ruthless in the sense that he would have no problem pulling a gun and shooting at somebody. All right, move along. Let's go. As a string of armored car heists in and around Boston reached historic levels, the FBI's Boston Bank Robbery Task Force had reason to believe that notorious bank robber Cormac Riley and his crew were somehow involved. Though there was no tangible evidence directly linking Riley to these recent jobs, they bore a striking similarity to the Minutemen robberies he had been involved in previously. We got 1 minute. You're going to count us down. The Minutemen robberies was a moniker given to a series of robberies committed by Cormac Riley, Shane O'Connell, and their criminal associates. Get down right now, get down! They carried out what were known as takeover robberies. Typically, that meant the robbers went over the counter, attempting to access the vault and get behind the teller line to obtain more money. What characterized these robberies was the extensive planning involved in each one. Cormac Riley would head directly toward the vault. Shane O'Connell would scoop cash out of the teller drawers. Then a third member would hold the floor with a stopwatch. 25 seconds. He would call out the times because they wanted to be in and out of the bank in under a minute. 30 seconds. That is how the Minutemen robberies earned their name. They would secure the money and exit so that the odds of being caught during the robbery were far lower than with an untrained crew. 15 seconds. Let's go. Everything was planned out and they did not linger on the scene. Later, it appeared the Minutemen had graduated from terrorizing defenseless bank tellers to knocking off armored cars. That was simply how things progressed in Charlestown. There was a strong tradition in that area to advance from bank robberies to armored cars. They would be able to obtain more loot by getting into the armored car and taking the bags it was delivering or picking up. Boosting armored cars meant confronting armed guards, which immediately heightened the potential for violence. It was not a game for amateurs. With Riley and O'Connell on its radar, the task force placed them under surveillance and began compiling a list of other likely members of the Minutemen crew. Cormac Riley was a very smart, cunning individual. He was very deliberate in everything he did. He was very cautious. He was reluctant to bring just anyone into his inner circle. Then there was Niall Donovan. Niall Donovan was another very intelligent, low-key individual. He was one of the people Riley loved to work with because he was so skilled. He was basically the architect of the switch from bank robberies to armored car robberies. Cian Murphy was an older guy. He was what they called a 10%er. He would set up the job for 10% of the take. Eamon Walsh had grown up in Charlestown and had served time in federal prison for bank robberies. His nickname was the Quiet Man because you never knew he was around. You never knew he was involved in anything. The real wild card in the crew was Riley's right-hand man, Shane O'Connell. He had a violent history. Shane O'Connell was a stone-cold addict. Shane O'Connell had been convicted years earlier of murdering a criminal associate in Charlestown. He was released after serving 10 years of an 18-year sentence. That was when he connected with Cormac Riley. Agents knew a great deal about the crew. Who they were, where they lived, how they operated. But they did not know where they would strike next or how to catch them. Surveillances in Charlestown were challenging. The agents kind of stood out there. It was just a very tough place because it was so condensed. And it was one of those communities where everyone knows everybody. But for the agents responsible for solving these crimes, it was not the only factor complicating their investigation. They were not the only ones robbing armored cars. There were many investigations ongoing in the Boston FBI office at that time. So during some periods they were under surveillance, while during others they were not, as something else would arise and the surveillance squad would be assigned elsewhere for the minute. This business model was effective, so it was only a matter of time before another payday arrived. That was what they did for a living. They robbed armored cars and banks. You have to commit some crimes to keep the money flowing. They would rob an armored car and a bank, and depending on how successful they were, one could gauge when another job might be expected. Following one heist, the crew carried out 2 more armored car robberies around the Boston area. Later, the FBI suspected their funds were beginning to run low, meaning the next heist was imminent. That morning, the armored car arrived. The courier exited the vehicle, went into the bank, and made some deliveries. Okay, we have 45 seconds on this. The more robberies they committed, the greater the likelihood of violence. It almost always felt as though it was only a matter of time before someone got hurt. For an extended period, a specialized FBI task force had been working to bring down this notorious gang of professional armed bandits when the unthinkable occurred. The courier exited and opened the door. At that point, the assault crew jumped from the minivan. The first robber got the drop on the courier. "It's a robbery!" Almost immediately, a shot was heard, and one of the guards went down. The courier reached for his weapon, so he was shot and thrown into the minivan. Then one of the individuals in the crew made their way into the armored car. Niall Donovan entered the driving compartment and got into some sort of a tussle with the driver. In the struggle, he lost his mask. What happened? The scumbag took my mask off. The events at this location were not typical of how this crew operated. There had never been any shots fired before. There had never been any person shot. Get this thing out of here. This was way above the norm. It was a horrendous armored car robbery. What are we going to do? After years of following the same playbook, the crew finally broke its routine. Realizing that everything was falling apart, they drove the armored car and the van to the wooded area where they had their rental truck waiting as the getaway vehicle. The road was just a long back country road with a couple of houses on it. There was a path, a dirt path, that led into the woods. At that location, there was some type of a switch. The proceeds from the armored car were transferred from the armored car to the rental truck. There was still a loose end to tie up. What would they do with the wounded courier, Derek Harlan? "Take the money and go, man, please." Harlan was pleading for his life. "Please, you don't have to do this. Please, you can let me go. Don't do this." Kean Murphy began duct taping his hands and ankles and actually tried to comfort him, to reassure him that he was going to be okay. "Riley, this is not good." "Yeah, really, stuff happens. Please, just let me go." "Now we gotta take care of this." Then the decision was made that because he had seen their faces and knew where they were from, he had to be killed. "You don't do this, please." And that was when he was executed. In keeping with the code of silence to ensure no one would be more culpable, they each shot both guards. The theory was that the suspects would have no incentive to talk about the crime or become the weak link who talked to the police because they had all shot the guards. It was not something normally seen during a robbery, two executions like this. Killing the witnesses did not end the crew's troubles. A mechanic at a nearby vehicle dump saw the rental truck and a white car leaving the woods and called the police. Local police arrived at the most grisly crime scene in the town's history. Detective Victor Lang was one of the first to respond. It was a scene he would never forget. He was in court and received a call to return right away because there had been this robbery. There had been a robbery, and it had gone bad. The robbers drove the truck, and police believed two other vehicles in a caravan to a clearing off the road. One witness said he saw a van pull out. When the police initially arrived, rather than going down the pathway, they cut through the woods so as not to contaminate any evidence that might be found at the scene. They were hoping to preserve anything: footprints, tire tracks, anything the killers might have left behind. I also saw Mr. Harlan's body. He had been executed. He was restrained, and then I walked over to the armored car. I hadn't seen anything like that where people had just been executed. It was traumatic for all of us. The FBI rushed to the scene. Murder was not the Charlestown crew's usual method of operation. Still, this heist bore their hallmarks. Investigators figured, literally on the first day, that there was probably involvement from the Charlestown armored car robbers. Agents had always known what this crew was capable of. They had simply prayed they would catch them before things escalated to murder. At that point, all sorts of resources were deployed. Everything from evidence technicians to surveillance squads. This time, the crew fled without covering their tracks. They left behind the mask in the armored car, as well as footprints and other trace evidence along the path. They also left a tire print on the side of the road, which became critical in the case. The decision to cut through the woods paid off for investigators. Forensic technicians made casts of the tire track. They could compare them to the tread on the getaway vehicle, if they could find it. The task force brought in renowned composite sketch artist Julian Voss to interview witnesses near both the bank and the dump site. Voss headed to the local diner to test a theory. The method of this group would be not just to go to a place, but to case it for a couple of days. So, by asking the waitresses, "Have you seen a group of people that you haven't seen before coming in here?" And the answer was yes. When you have somebody who relies on their memory to help maintain their livelihood, they know that if you walk in and order the poached egg with a black coffee, it is going to affect the size of the tip. So, these waitresses made very good witnesses. It does not matter how brief the encounter might be. The amount of information that people are capable of retaining is incredible. Voss's hunch paid off. The waitresses described Cormac Riley and his crew. The task force now had the positive link to Riley they had been seeking, but they still needed concrete physical evidence before they could take him and his gang off the street for good. Their witness at the vehicle dump site could hold the key. He had worked on truck engines and car engines his whole life. So he was able to give a description not only of the truck, but also a pretty good description of what kind of engine it had in it. The rental truck was a cab-over design, which means the cab sits directly over the engine. A state trooper got into the yellow pages and started looking for rental truck places that corresponded to that specific make. It turned out there was only one place in the entire region that rented cab-over trucks. They discovered that one had been rented shortly before the robbery. The next step was to figure out when the truck was being returned. Investigators called the company and learned the truck was due back soon. A plan was put in place to have a state trooper pose as an employee of the rental company to receive that truck back so they would know exactly who returned it. The undercover officer just needed to wait for the suspect to come to him, but whoever was driving would be jittery after the bungled job. The robber was now a desperate, wanted killer, which meant the officer had to be ready for anything. Through quick thinking and incredible detective work, the FBI Bank Robbery Task Force learned that the truck used in the deadly armored car robbery was on its way back to a rental lot. To apprehend its driver, an undercover state trooper posed as an employee. While waiting for this truck to be returned, the trooper was in place. As the truck pulled into the lot, no one was sure who was going to get out or what would happen if the driver made him as a cop. Eamon Walsh returned that truck to the rental company. The same Eamon Walsh, who was a known associate of Cormac Riley, Shane O'Connell, and the rest of the crew. Do you think I could get you to sign this? Agents were present when Walsh returned that vehicle. It was immediately apparent that he was either involved or he may have known who was involved in this crime. The FBI and the state police were able to open up their intelligence files on Eamon Walsh. Returning a truck was not enough for an arrest, so they let him walk for now. The vehicle was impounded by the FBI for further examination. A forensic team went over the rental truck thoroughly. Special Agent Derek Shaw, head of the FBI's evidence response team, gave it the fine-tooth comb treatment. When everything was said and done, it was his job to evaluate the evidence that was collected. Specifically, they were processing for fingerprints. One print was especially promising. The state police lieutenant was processing the side door of the truck. As he was dusting along the molding, a fingerprint appeared. He photographed the fingerprint and took it with a hinge fingerprint lifter and adhesive lifter. It was turned over to be put into AFIS, the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System maintained by the FBI. They ran dozens of prints from the rental truck through the database, but only the one from the truck door matched a member of the crew. The fingerprint was identified as one of the known fingerprints of Niall Donovan. From that point on, evidence began to develop toward that crew for the robbery and the murders. To make their case, agents needed a strong foundation. That started by proving the rental truck was linked to where the guards' bodies were dumped. A lab examiner built a frame. They packed the frame with playground-quality sand, packed it hard and tight. Then they drove the truck over the sandbox and got the impression of the tire of the vehicle. They made a cast of that tire and matched it along with the cast left at the crime scene. They were certain they had the right vehicle. They had conclusively tied two of the Charlestown crew to the robbery and murders. It was a good start, and it also gave the task force leverage they hoped would lead to bringing the entire team down. As it turned out, the events rattled the once meticulous gang so much that they began making stupid mistakes. Early the next morning, a car was found burning in Revere by a police officer. The car was not fully burnt at that point, and there were a number of items located in that trunk that were able to be processed as evidence. They had set the car on fire but then closed all the windows, so the car being shut up as it was cut off all the oxygen so the fire went out. They found some t-shirts, one that had reference to leprechauns on it. The logo belonged to a softball team at a federal prison. A former member of that team's roster was Cormac Riley. Now certain who he was dealing with, lead investigator Special Agent Marcus Hale headed to Charlestown. He was determined to find someone with ties to the Riley crew he could persuade to break the code of silence. Ryan Doherty was a mid-level drug dealer. He was a drug dealer to Cormac Riley. He was a drug dealer to Shane O'Connell. They went to Doherty's girlfriend's apartment to try and locate him. They were trying to establish alibis, and then, through the investigation, defeat the alibi with facts. When he first met Doherty, he pretty much walked into a full-blown domestic situation with Doherty and his girlfriend, who was pregnant at the time. It was just a terrible mess. Like everyone else in Charlestown, Ryan Doherty refused to rat to the FBI. I just want to ask a couple questions. No way, man. Code of silence. I ain't talking about nothing. But when Doherty got arrested later on unrelated charges, Hale seized the opportunity. He believed strongly that Doherty could help them out, and they figured that if they could convince Doherty's girlfriend, they might be able to do something with him. So they would periodically check in on her. If she needed money to buy milk, they would give her some to buy milk. "You can't be here. I'm just trying to help you out." With Doherty out of the picture, little by little, she started warming to the FBI's overtures. In the meantime, under the watchful eye of the task force, Cormac Riley and his crew were on their best behavior. They saw the agents. They were starting to think they had gotten away with it. The agents did a lot more surveillance on them than they typically would, but again, one had to understand that at the time, they knew they had screwed up by shooting those guards, and they were going to be extra cautious. They did not flash money. They had money stashed, and they would slowly spend it, supporting their children and the mothers of their children. It was really not a flashy lifestyle that anyone would notice. Time passed while the agents worked to build their case. Later, Shane O'Connell was arrested on a parole violation and sent to prison. With O'Connell out of the picture, the feeling was that the crew was vulnerable. But was it enough for them to win over Ryan Doherty's girlfriend? No one rats in Charlestown ever. Time for Agent Hale to make another move and change that. Every time they went, they would leave her with the thought that there could be something better for her if she and Ryan decided mutually that this is what they wanted to do. "Ryan, I just think it's a good idea, okay?" It worked. She convinced her boyfriend to talk. They had him removed from the correctional institution where he was being housed, and they spent hours talking to him about all the things that he could do for them. Ryan had information on almost every bank or armored car robbery that had happened in recent years. Agents had cracked the code of silence, and now it was time to leverage it. So Doherty was transferred to the same prison as Shane O'Connell. "How they treating you in here?" "I'm fine." The wire was put on Doherty. Doherty went out for yard time, walked the yard, and engaged O'Connell in a conversation. "How's Riley doing? Is he mad?" "Nah, man, he's cool." And The big thing that O'Connell told Doherty over and over was, "I don't mind going to jail for this case as long as it's not because of some screw-up that I made. I knew I burnt that car the wrong way." Shane O'Connell's job was to burn the vehicle, but he was not particularly successful. "I screwed up, man." With Shane O'Connell's taped admission, this made 3 crew members the FBI could connect to the double murder. But the task force was determined to get everyone, especially the men at the top, Cormac Riley. As they began to debrief Doherty more and more, and Doherty would talk about knowledge of bank robberies involving Cormac Riley, O'Connell, Cian Murphy, Niall Donovan, they started to think about a RICO prosecution. RICO, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, is the federal statute the FBI often uses to go after organized crime groups. The RICO statute allows for prosecuting a criminal organization engaged in bank robbery, extortion, and so on. It is designed to be very heavy-handed in a good way, and you can bring that charge against groups like this, where there was a lot of planning, a lot of conspiracy aspects to it, and they were committing crimes in a very organized sort of way over a period of time. It is a very effective statute to be able to use. A RICO conviction could mean life sentences for the entire crew. But RICO cases are not without risks. Riley was still out on the street. Cian Murphy and Niall Donovan were smart enough that they were just completely laying low. They were not engaging in any type of criminal activity. Riley could not help himself, though. He had to rob something. Robbery was part of Riley's nature, and he was never going to stop until the FBI took him down. In the period after 2 guards were killed during an armored car robbery, a crack in the once impenetrable Charlestown Code of Silence gave the FBI the edge it needed to zero in on their prime suspects. Everything that had been learned about the crew made it clear that they needed to take these guys off the streets as quickly as possible. They had surveillance assets on their suspects for a long time. One of the surveillance teams that was on Cormac Riley observed him steal a Jeep Cherokee. There was only one reason for Riley to steal a vehicle. There were certain patterns. They would steal the car, then stash it, and use it in an upcoming robbery. After the Jeep was stolen, it was driven from one area through downtown and up to a suburb north of the city. There it was parked in a hotel parking lot and left. When they saw that, they were hoping that this time they were ahead of them. So, they put surveillance on that vehicle, and one of the other agents on the squad was actually able to get a court order authorizing them to install a microphone and listening device in the vehicle. The FBI kept eyes on Riley around the clock. They knew he was going to hit a bank. So, they had the special surveillance group out watching that vehicle and watching Riley to make his move. The agents watched as Riley and his new accomplices selected their target. They just knew that they were casing banks to see which one they were going to do. Then they started coming back again and again to the bank in Wakefield. With the target selected, it would only be a matter of time. After a couple of days, their waiting paid off. One afternoon, the surveillance team reported that somebody had come back to that vehicle. There was a second vehicle involved. It was a Ford Bronco. There were 3 people all together. The Bronco pulled up and 2 got out and got into the Jeep. 2 vehicles then left in tandem. They parked the Bronco a distance away from the bank. 1 person remained in the Bronco. Riley and another accomplice continued on toward the bank in the second vehicle. What they did not know was that the FBI had a SWAT team following them every step of the way. The plan was for the SWAT team to pen them in once they reached the parking lot before they could enter the bank. The tricky part was that you did not want the robbers to get inside the bank. So you were trying to stop them before they got into the bank. But you had to let them go pretty far, because otherwise the legality would be an issue. They could say they were thinking about robbing a bank, but change their mind before doing it. They started to approach the bank that the agents thought they were going to rob. They were approaching it very slowly, coming through the bank parking lot. The SWAT team was moved into the parking lot. They were watching the bank and listening because of the bug in the car. All right, I'm going to go in the vault and clear it out. You're going to go straight for the teller. All right, it's on. Agents moved in to corral Riley's SUV. When the driver saw the vehicles coming toward him, he said something. The guy in the back said, What is it?" "Nothing." Riley said, "Never mind." "Anyway, so like I was saying, you're going to go straight for the teller?" Then he said, "Shit." Again. Again, the guy in the back seat said, "What is the problem?" "What?" And Riley said, "Feds. Feds, 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 feds." "Oh, shoot. Hands up. Put your hands up. Drop the gun. Get up. What do we got? What do we—" It was chaotic because there was commotion with the other guys on the SWAT team and the passenger in the back. "Drop the gun. Drop the gun. Drop the gun." He had a submachine gun, so they were concerned for their safety. "Drop the gun. Drop the gun. Drop the gun. Drop it. Keep your hands up. Roll me over." They took the mask off the driver, and it was Cormac Riley. The agent was satisfied that he was able to be the one to put the handcuffs on Cormac Riley because of all the robberies he had done, all the robberies the agent had gone to, and all the witnesses interviewed who were very upset based on their fear of this guy during those robberies. What goes around comes around. Finally, you're not in control. We're in control. A period after the murders, Cormac Riley was behind bars. It took additional time to build cases against the rest of the Charlestown crew. Once they determined that they had enough probable cause to arrest these people, a plan was put in place to round up the entire group at one time. The idea was to get them all very early in the morning, all at the same time. They had the list of the subjects with arrest warrants, and they were basically checking them off as they were taken into custody. Over the course of a couple of hours, they all got arrested. One agent remembered thinking that it was the end of an era. But there would probably be another era. When Eamon Walsh was arrested, they put local police handcuffs on him. It was a symbolic gesture, but it was an important gesture for the people of the town. The town had been so rocked by this crime that they wanted to be able to tell the townspeople that they did not give up. They brought this man to justice. And local police handcuffs were put on his wrist as he was being led off. Cormac Riley, Shane O'Connell, Niall Donovan, Cian Murphy, and Eamon Walsh were charged under the federal RICO statute. Riley, O'Connell, Donovan, and Murphy were convicted in federal court on dozens of racketeering charges that included bank robbery and the murder of the two guards. All received life sentences. Eamon Walsh, who was not charged with the deaths, was also convicted of racketeering and handed a lengthy prison sentence. He eventually died behind bars. For Cormac Riley in Charlestown, his role models were his fathers, the uncles, the brothers who were all involved in criminal activities. Riley and O'Connell both told Daugherty, "Everybody thinks we do this for the money. That's only part of it. We do it for the rush. There's nothing like doing this. The feeling that you get, the feeling of power, is unbelievable. They were just awful human beings. We pulled it off. It took a long time. It was a tremendous effort, and it was just like a tremendous exhale. It's finally over, thank God. We got him off the street."